Let's talk.
Sure. Let me know when that backup's ready.
Aye, sir.
All due respect, sir, I hope this isn't some kind of Starfleet pep talk. I'm really too busy.
I'm taking over the center seat, Will.
You're what?
I'm replacing you as captain of the Enterprise. You'll stay on as executive officer. A temporary grade reduction to commander.
You personally are assuming command?
Yeah.
May I ask why?
My experience. 5 years out there dealing with unknowns like this. My familiarity with the Enterprise, its crew.
Admiral, this is an almost totally new Enterprise. You don't know her a tenth as well as I do.
That's why you're staying aboard. I'm sorry, Will.
No, Admiral. I don't think you're sorry. Not one damn bit. I remember when you recommended me for this command. You told me how envious you were and how much you hoped you'd find a way to get a Starship Command again. Well, sir, it looks like you found a way.
Report to the bridge, Commander. Immediately.
Aye, sir.
In a world overflowing with movies, we need a hero. Someone to separate the bad from the good.
Sounds like a job. Verbal dioramas. Watches all the movies from comedy to drama. From the top roll sound. And don't forget the action. She'll watch until the end and then she'll give you her reaction. Movies you know, movies you don't. Prequel, sequels, remakes, and trivia and outtakes. Movies you know, movies you don't. Interesting stories, all the categories.
Hi everyone, I'm Emma. Welcome to Verbal Diorama episode 259, Star Trek, the motion picture. This is the podcast that's all about the history and legacy of movies you know and movies you don't. And as always, welcome to Verbal Diorama. Whether you are a regularly returning listener, whether you are a brand new listener to this podcast, thank you for being here. Thank you for choosing to listen to this podcast. Live long and prosper. I'm happy to have you here for the history and legacy of Star Trek, the motion picture. And before we jump into everything Star Trek, this is going to be a fairly chunky episode, I think. But I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who listens to this podcast and has continued to listen to and support this podcast. It genuinely means so much to a little indie podcaster that you are here listening to me when there are plenty of other podcasts that you could be listening to instead. Most recently on this podcast, well, I've done a whole season of remakes on this podcast last month. I did double episodes on Clash of the Titans, Dawn of the Dead, The Italian Job, West Side Story, and then the most recent episode of this podcast was back to a single episode on The Incredible Knives Out. But I wanted to switch it up a little bit. And one of the things that I do get asked for on this podcast are some of the big franchises, mostly Star Wars and Star Trek. Now, I don't feel quite ready to do one of the big Star Wars movies. I have done a Star Wars movie. Many years ago, I did an episode on Rogue One. But I really liked that movie because it's so separate to everything else. But I've never before done a Star Trek movie. I've covered many movies based on TV shows, most recently The Flintstones. And the idea of recreating that cartoon aesthetic in live action on that movie is something else entirely. I adore that movie so much for what it does to make it look like a live action cartoon. But when your movie is based off a live action TV show, surely it's pretty easy to translate it, right? But what if it's been a while? What if every attempt so far had failed? What if you decided to make a new TV show instead, but without one of your show's biggest stars? And what if a science fiction space opera comes out and becomes the biggest thing since sliced bread? What do? Well, you explore strange new worlds, seek out new life and new civilizations, and wherever you go, you boldly go. Here's the trailer for Star Trek, the motion picture.
Travel forward with us, 300 years into the future, to confront the greatest mystery ever to threaten mankind. We are aboard a huge starship called the Enterprise. This is the return of Captain Kirk.
An alien object of unbelievable destructive power is less than 3 days away from this planet.
Mr. Spock,
I offer my services as science officer.
Dr. McCoy, Scotty, and joining them on their mission, Commander Will Decker and Navigator Ilea.
I'm sorry.
That you left Delta for? Or that you didn't even say goodbye?
Get us back in impulse power. Full reverse.
Wormhole distortion has overloaded the main power systems. Delay phaser order. Fire torpedoes.
This, then, is the epic journey of the Starship Enterprise, traveling to the outer limits of time and space to challenge a vast, living machine of destruction. The human adventure is just beginning. Star Trek, the motion picture.
A Gene Roddenberry production. A Robert Wise film.
When a massive cloud-like being destroys 3 powerful Klingon cruisers, Captain James T. Kirk returns to the newly transformed USS Enterprise to take command. An alien spacecraft of enormous power enters Federation space and neutralizes everything in its path. While on Vulcan, Spock detects a consciousness from the cloud and boards the Enterprise to help. The entire crew mobilizes at warp speed to intercept the alien intruder V'Ger on its relentless flight towards Earth. Let's run through the cast. We have William Shatner as James T. Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as Spock, DeForest Kelley as Leonard McCoy, James Doohan as Montgomery Scott, Walter Koenig as Pavel Chekhov, Nichelle Nichols as Uhura, George Takei as Hikaru Sulu, Persis Kambata as Ilea, and Stephen Collins as Willard Decker. Star Trek the Motion Picture has a screenplay by Harold Livingston, story by Alan Dean Foster, was directed by Robert Wise, and was based on Star Trek by Gene Roddenberry. So first off, I feel like I have to give a disclaimer, because the Star Trek story is a huge story. And I need to fit this huge story into one episode, with a plan to go into future Star Trek movies at some point. So I feel like I need to make it really clear, this is not an episode about Star Trek, because I feel like I could never give that the proper treatment it deserves. There are copious podcasts who do go into amazing detail on the history of Star Trek as a franchise. And I feel like I need to say this because as a huge franchise with passionate fans who know a lot about this franchise, I don't want this episode to be a disappointment in any way. And when I say the pressure for this episode was high, I mean it was quite high. But I wanted to purely focus on the beginnings of Star Trek the Motion Picture and how that came to be and how that movie influenced Star Trek going forward in a brief and condensed kind of verbal diorama hour-ish episode. So I teased last episode that this one would be a huge franchise set in space with a mega fandom. Considering I'd also talked about Rian Johnson's Star Wars movie, I guess I figured people would think it was Star Wars. But Star Wars is also kind of relevant to the history of Star Trek the Motion Picture, but not as integral as you might think. It's true that the May 1977 premiere of Star Wars was an unmitigated success story, and in its wake, other studios scrambled to put their own science fiction space operas on the big screen. 20th Century Fox would sue Universal Studios over the release of Battlestar Galactica in 1978, claiming it had stolen 34 distinct ideas from Star Wars, which led to Universal countersuing, claiming Star Wars had stolen their ideas from Silent Running. Lawsuits aside, Battlestar Galactica was a huge success, despite it actually being an edit of the pilot episode of the TV series. A similar thing was done with Buck Rogers in the 25th century. It was a TV pilot, but it was released theatrically and it also did similarly well financially. But Star Wars influencing Star Trek the motion picture isn't really the whole story. Star Trek's creator, Gene Roddenberry, sold Star Trek to NBC in 1964 with the idea to address modern issues through a science fiction lens. The series addressed discrimination, slavery, and warfare with interracial casting and a multi-ethnic crew. Star Trek ran for 3 seasons on NBC before being cancelled in 1969 due to low ratings. It was after this that the show went into syndication, and it was sold to 150 domestic and 60 international markets, that its popularity started growing and it started to develop a huge cult following. Fans started to grow in number and fan conventions started happening in the early 70s. And all the while, Star Trek was growing in popularity on screens across the world. In the days before the internet, fans communicated through letters, would you believe that? And sent hundreds to both Gene Roddenberry and Paramount, expressing their love for the show and wanting it to return. In the meantime, Star Trek the Animated Series had 2 seasons, airing between 1973 to 1974, starring the original cast and received critical acclaim. As a kid in the 80s, I do remember watching the odd episode of the original series, although to be honest, I mostly watched The Next Generation, and even then it was on and off. I will never proclaim to be the biggest Star Trek fan in the universe. I just am not. In fact, till I watched the movie for this episode, I had no idea The Next Generation had used part of Jerry Goldsmith's motion picture theme for its own theme music. Verbal diorama truly is a learning exercise for us all. Due to the original series' popularity in syndication, Paramount Pictures began to consider making a Star Trek film as early as 1972, and by 1975, a film version of Star Trek was announced. Not the Gene Roddenberry penned Star Trek The God Thing, which was rejected by Paramount in July 1976, nor any other iteration by Harlan Ellison, Robert Silverberg, or John D.F. Black, but Star Trek Planet of the Titans, written by Chris Bryant and Alan Scott, and to be directed by Philip Kaufman. Bryant and Scott delivered a 20-page treatment in October 1976. Everyone liked it, Gene Roddenberry stopped other work to focus on Star Trek, and filming locations started to be scouted. Production designer Ken Adam and artist Ralph McQuarrie were hired, and they worked on new concept art for the Enterprise and new planetary designs. The plan was to shoot in the UK, but William Shatner's contract with Paramount had expired, and Leonard Nimoy was in the middle of legal proceedings. I'm going to come back to Leonard Nimoy. But there was no script yet, and the first draft wouldn't be finished until March 1977. This script was ultimately rejected, and feeling like they were stuck between conflicting ideas and the egos of those involved, including Roddenberry, Kaufman, and executives Barry Diller, Jeffrey Katzenberg, and Michael Eisner, Bryant and Scott left the project in March 1977. Kaufman created a new script treatment, but that was also rejected. So this was March 1977. And then, Star Wars. In May 1977, the Los Angeles Times reported that the Star Trek film had been put on hold due to reworking the script. This happened 23 days before Star Wars premiered. By June 1977, Star Trek Planet of the Titans was officially cancelled, with Paramount deciding not to compete in the science fiction movie category and instead shifted their efforts to a new Star Trek TV series, Star Trek Phase 2. Star Trek Phase 2 was going to be the flagship show for the new Paramount television service, to be aired at 8 p.m, the primetime slot, and have a 2-hour pilot. There's those long pilot episodes again. Followed by 13 hour-long episodes, with Gene Roddenberry given complete creative control over Star Trek Phase 2. The original series actors were approached to reprise their roles, except for Leonard Nimoy. As I said, I'm coming back to Leonard. New characters, Science Officer Lieutenant Zon, Navigator Lieutenant Ilea, and Ship's Executive Officer Willard Decker were created, and I'm going to come back to them too. Very few of the crew returned from the original series. The only notable exceptions were costume designer William Ware Thies and illustrator Mike Miner. Science fiction novelist Alan Dean Foster was hired to write the 2-hour pilot titled In Thy Image. but the task would eventually fall to producer Harold Livingston. Robert Collins was hired to direct In Thy Image. New sketches, models, sets and props were created for Star Trek Phase 2. The Enterprise would differ in layout, design and detailing, and the costumes and props would also reflect the changes. Star Trek Phase 2 wouldn't be in pre-production for long though. Numbers were crunched on the viability of the Paramount television service, and advertising revenues were anticipated to be low. Charles Blue Dawn, lovely callback to the Italian job there, was Paramount Pictures' parent company Gulf and Western's chairman. He refused to back the plan, and by August 1977, 2 months after it was conceived, the announcement was made internally that plans had changed. Star Trek Phase 2 would not be a 2-hour pilot plus 13 episodes of a TV series. The 2-hour pilot would, yep, you've guessed it, be reformatted into a feature film. But they didn't want a negative fan reaction to the news of the cancellation of the Star Trek sequel series, so this was kept out of the public eye and scripts were continued to be written and work continued behind the scenes. 7 months later, a public announcement was made. Star Trek would not be returning to TV, but instead it would be a big-budget, big-screen adventure titled Star Trek the Motion Picture, and it would be directed by Robert Wise. I mentioned 2 episodes ago on West Side Story would be coming back to Robert Wise. This is how we're coming back to Robert Wise. Robert Wise was a hugely acclaimed editor and director, 4-time Academy Award winner, most famous for West Side Story and The Sound of Music. He seemed like a strange choice, but he was a safe pair of hands. And as I'll come to a bit later, Wise was never truly happy with the version of this film that was released, and he considered it unfinished, but again, gonna come back to that. One thing I'm coming back round to is Leonard Nimoy, because one person missing in both Star Trek Phase 2's cast and going forward into Star Trek the Motion Picture was Leonard Nimoy. Nimoy had agreed to appear in the planned film Star Trek The God Thing when that was originally talked about in the early 70s, but in the following years he was engaged in a lawsuit regarding the use of his likeness. He was having dinner with his friend Henry Fonda in London in 1975, and Fonda asked Nimoy what he thought of the Spock billboards. He was referencing Heineken billboards featuring Nimoy's likeness as Spock, and Nimoy had no idea about them. When he returned home, he found that Heineken's billboard campaign had not been granted permission to use his likeness. Even worse, he discovered that Paramount had stopped paying him for his image licensing years before. So he sued Paramount. Nimoy refused to take part in Phase 2 or read the screenplay for Star Trek the Motion Picture until the studio settled the lawsuit. The original incarnations of the script for the motion picture left out the character of Spock, and a replacement character, the Vulcan Zon, was created for Star Trek Phase 2 instead, to be played by David Gautreaux. For all intents and purposes, Star Trek the Motion Picture would need to go forward without one of its most famous and recognisable faces. Robert Wise was admittedly not a huge fan of Star Trek when he took the job of directing the motion picture. He watched some episodes of the series and grew to love the show, but he would begin to understand how important the character of Spock was. He knew the movie would not be Star Trek without Nimoy. Wise sent Jeffrey Katzenberg to New York City to speak with Nimoy, who met with him at a restaurant with the aim to persuade him to return to the production. Knowing of the lawsuit and Nimoy's displeasure at his treatment over royalties, Katzenberg signed a check for Nimoy's lost royalties. Katzenberg was not beneath getting down on his knees and begging Nimoy to return. After meeting with Katzenberg, Nimoy would express his displeasure with the script, and they came to an understanding that Nimoy would need to approve the final version. Because the script was constantly changing, and it didn't help that Paramount pre-sold the film to theatres before the script was even finished. And this pressure, combined with personality clashes, led to constant arguments behind the scenes between Gene Roddenberry and Harold Livingston. Robert Wise was the almost live-in referee for their near-constant feuds. Livingston would call Roddenberry a B-word. Roddenberry was precious about his creation and liked to exert control. Livingston thought his ideas were hokum and had zero respect for him. Put bluntly, they didn't get on at all. In adapting Alan Dean Foster's story, which Livingston also didn't like, he would write pages which would then be reworked by Roddenberry. He'd tear those up and start again. The two men, who had an amicable relationship at first, would get into screaming matches over the direction of the story. The studio ultimately backed Livingston in a meeting between them and Michael Eisner, which led to them admonishing Roddenberry, taking him off the writing of the movie, compensating him, and making him executive consultant for future films instead. But this came with no creative control. The new cast already hired for Phase 2, Stephen Collins as Decker and Persis Kambata as Ilea, would be retained for the new movie, as well as David Gautreaux, not as the Vulcan Zon due to Nimoy's return, but in a new role as Commander Branch. Persis Kambata was a former Miss India in 1965 and Miss Universe participant, which is apt, I guess, considering the Enterprise travels all across it. She took the role of the Deltan Lieutenant Ilea, knowing she would need to shave her head for it, as well as planning for a 5-year stint for the Phase 2 TV series. When Phase 2 became Star Trek the Motion Picture, it meant a greater impact on her career, but also 4 years of lost work. Deltans are a strikingly beautiful race, and unlike Vulcans, don't repress their emotions. Deltans live sex-orientated lives, hence her vow of celibacy to work on the Enterprise. Hundreds of actresses tested for the role of Ilea, but only Kambata still wowed the producers by looking stunningly beautiful, totally bald. Her short, skimpy dress for the role of the Vija-controlled Ilea was Kambata's idea. I'm not really going to go into Stephen Collins, only to say he admitted committing inappropriate sexual misconduct against 3 female minors in the 70s, 80s and 90s. So, not a good guy. Going forward into the next generation, the character of Deanna Troi and her history with First Officer Will Riker was based on Ilea and her relationship with Will Decker. But back to the original cast, because these actors had started in these roles in 1966. It was now 1978, so they were 12 years older when they first donned the famous Starfleet uniforms, and many had spent the intervening years after the original series was cancelled on the convention circuit, including William Shatner. It was supposed to be a momentous reunion, but the sense of camaraderie that was expected failed to materialise. Nearly 10 months after the release of Star Wars in March 1978, Paramount held the biggest press conference in company history to reveal Star Trek the Motion Picture, Robert Wise as the director, and confirmed the whole cast was returning. To say fans were happy was an understatement. The gang was back together and filming was due to commence in late spring 1978. But the script still wasn't complete, and changes were still ongoing, with both key actors, notably William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, and producers requesting changes. Other actors requested characterization changes, but were mostly ignored. The last third of the script constantly changed, with hours noted on revisions as well as dates, and as filming commenced, actors were told not to memorise third act lines, just in case they changed. The final draft of the third act was approved in September 1978, but only after renowned NASA scientist Robert Jastrow confirmed that mechanical forms of life, such as Vija, were a scientific possibility. The studio didn't want to approve it otherwise. Star Trek has always been rooted in reality, and in the intervening years between the original series and the motion picture, many of its technologies had become reality. Roddenberry was especially insistent that everything on the Enterprise be rooted in scientific theory, including aerospace engineer at NASA and Star Trek fan Jesko von Puttkamer providing technical advice. He contributed the hypothetical theory behind the faster-than-light space warp drive and the wormhole effect featured in the film. Even science fiction writer Isaac Asimov consulted on the film, feeling that the wormhole should be a temporal tunnel instead. Star Trek the Motion Picture, unlike Phase 2, was going to be shot in 70mm, so the sets that had been built and furnished for the TV show in 1977 weren't going to cut it for the big screen experience. Wise hired Harold Michelson as production designer, and he got to work completing the new sets, based on production illustrator Michael Miner's designs. While some parts of Phase 2's sets remained, like the bridge consoles, new ones like Chekhov's weapons station had to be built from scratch. It was Wise's idea to have safety mechanisms built into the seats, not seat belts, but a tray that could secure the lap. If you need any more evidence on how seriously Robert Wise took this task, that was it. Safety in space came first. You just don't know if you need to brake suddenly during warp speed. The cast had grown up, the crew of the Enterprise had grown up, Kirk was an admiral now, Spock was off on Vulcan doing the Kolinar to purge himself of his remaining humanity, and Bones was now sporting 70s disco attire. The famous Starfleet coloured tunics were gone, replaced with sometimes a little unflattering pantsuits in hues of grey, blue and beige, with shoes built in, heels for the female crew obviously. An Italian shoemaker decorated by the Italian government for making Gucci shoes was tasked with creating the futuristic footwear. Ship assignments were now noted by the uniform's badges, and while the materials look like man-made synthetics, they are actually all natural materials, thanks to renowned costume designer Robert Fletcher. Robert Wise wanted uniforms to be futuristic but not draw attention. Fletcher wanted something not easily duplicated, hence the all-in-ones. He created more than 700 costumes for Star Trek the Motion Picture in less than 10 months, directing in excess of 200 drapers, cutters, tailors, operators, finishers, plastic workers, moulders, shoemakers and assistants. It wasn't just the crew of the Enterprise though, but also other beings. He designed the Vulcan civilian attire as well as the priest and priestesses' clothing. Fletcher found materials for casual clothing from the storerooms of Paramount as well as from other productions, including The Ten Commandments. Paramount still has one of the rarest storehouses of materials in existence. The most expensive costume ever worn by a Hollywood extra was on this movie. It is a single flawless bolt of material, which Cecil B. DeMille had personally chosen in 1939. It cost $10,000 for the fabric alone, and it was turned into a red, black and gold brocade, which was woven with real gold and silver wrapped around silk thread, and this was used for the background Beetlejuicean chief ambassador. Filming on Star Trek the Motion Picture began on the 7th of August 1978, and security on set was tight, but despite this, stories would leak about the production, the plot, and would eventually be published in March 1979's version of New West magazine. 2 days after filming commenced, the production was already a day behind schedule. The script was still being rewritten. Every time the script changed, they'd re-storyboard, which was incredibly time-consuming. At Leonard Nimoy's request, screenwriter Dennis Clark was brought in to make changes to the story that would better suit Spock. However, he quickly left after a falling out with Gene Roddenberry. More rewrites were carried out by Harold Livingston, but as I've already mentioned, he also had disagreements with Roddenberry. Livingston would leave the production 3 times and had to be persuaded to return 3 times. At one point, Jeffrey Katzenberg also left the production, but Michael Eisner was able to persuade him to come back. During filming in August 1978, Leonard Nimoy, William Shatner and Gene Roddenberry worked together to come up with a final act. After 125 days, filming finally wrapped on the 26th of January 1979. The visual effects would be originally handed to Robert Abel and Associates after both Douglas Trumbull, who'd worked on 2001 A Space Odyssey, and John Dykstra, who'd worked on Star Wars, were both unavailable. Robert Abel and Associates were new to visual effects, but had big ideas and bid $4 million to take on the task, despite internal estimates suggesting it was more along the lines of $6 million. Robert Abel was a pioneer of computer graphics and believed they could use cutting-edge techniques for the visual effects using computer graphics to make Star Trek the Motion Picture be truly, excuse the pun, out of this world. A year into production though, and with millions already spent, there was seemingly no usable footage from Robert Abel and Associates. A camera tracking device promised by Abel to be completed by September 1978 was nowhere near completion. Miniatures and matte paintings had been created, and they split work with effects artist Richard Urich, but Abel's unique vision started to wear thin when his team just wasn't delivering on any promises. In fact, they were known for running late with effects work, as well as often coming in over budget for commercial work. But when news dropped they were working on Star Trek, their commercial division was overlooked, so they took out huge press ads advertising their own commercial team. Meanwhile, Abel himself had worked his way up from an initial 140 visual effects scenes on Star Trek the Motion Picture to over 350. But as time progressed, the relationship between Abel and Associates and Paramount started to crumble. When Abel kept demanding more money, Paramount demanded a definitive final figure, which was an extra $12 million, making it a total of $16 million just for visual effects, which was still unfinished. Following the failure of Robert Abel and Associates to finish the visual effects, Douglas Trumbull joined the production, first working alongside Robert Abel and Associates, and eventually Paramount pushed Robert Abel and Associates out completely in January 1979. Paramount, keen to reap some of their costs back, renegotiated with Abel in February 1979 with a final ultimatum: produce an optical effects sequence to the studio's liking or leave the picture. Abel would produce a partially complete visual effects sequence, which was screened for executives and director Robert Wise, who had a reputation as a calm and patient man. But Wise was visibly angry at the sequence, and the decision was made to use one of Abel's sequences in the finished movie, but otherwise Robert Abel and his team would be fired, effective immediately, which left Douglas Trumbull. Douglas Trumbull passed away in 2022, but in a career of notable achievements, one of his greatest was building the Enterprise for this movie. Trumbull discussed in the past the difficulties associated with the enormous undertaking, saying his team worked non-stop for around 7 months to complete the visual effects for the movie, which needed as many shots as Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind put together. Along with Richard Urich, Trumbull reassembled his Close Encounters team and enlisted Apogee Productions, owned by John Dykstra, to help finish the effects in time. Dykstra had previously worked with Trumbull on his 1972 film Silent Running and had played a key role in the realisation of the motion-controlled cameras for Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope. A number of scenes that called for miniatures were handled by Apogee, such as the Epsilon 9 shots of the Enterprise approaching the V'Ger and Klingon Katinga-class warships. Many more shots, including views of the Enterprise and the interiors of V'Ger, were provided by Trumbull's company EEG. Star Trek the Motion Picture uses a lot of models that were made by Magicam. The primary Enterprise model was designed by concept artist Andrew Probert and measured 8 feet in length at 1 to 120th scale. Building it cost $150,000 and took 14 months. This 85-pound Enterprise was built out of lightweight plastics rather than fiberglass. Its aluminium skeleton was arc welded, and it could be supported at any one of 5 locations, depending on the needs of the various camera angles. The whole surface was smoothed, but under certain lighting conditions, a unique paint finish gave it an iridescent appearance. For long shots, a second 20-inch model of the ship was used. The original model of V'Ger was made by the Able Group, but it wasn't a standard, and so this was replaced with designer Sid Mead's 68-foot model made from wood, foam, styrofoam and incandescent neon and strobe lights, built from the rear forwards so that the camera crews could film with an incomplete model. Prop master Dick Rubin created 350 props, 55 of which were used just for the San Francisco scene. The new phaser alone cost $4,000 and 15 were made for the film, and the communicators were redesigned as wrist-based. 200 were created with a couple of high-end $3,500 models used for close-ups. Trumbull initially declined Paramount's invitation to work on the movie because of a contract dispute with the studio. But remember I mentioned Paramount had sold the rights to theatres already? Well, Paramount had pocketed $30 million, and delays and issues with the visual effects meant they were in danger of not making their planned release date, which meant theatre owners had banded together and were ready to file a class action lawsuit. Taking advantage of the studio's desperation to produce Star Trek the Motion Picture, Trumbull agreed, and the studio wrote him a blank check to use as much money as possible to get the movie finished as soon as possible, ballooning the movie's budget to $46 million, the most expensive film ever made at that point. With Trumbull and Uri Rich reassembling the crew and equipment from Close Encounters of the Third Kind, it amassed more personnel, and it wasn't like they didn't have the money, because time was the main issue here, and to fix it, they'd need all the help they could get. John Dykstra brought with him a further 60 people. Crews worked in 3 shifts a day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It was Trumbull who wanted an extended dry dock scene for the first viewing of the Enterprise. He wanted to take what he'd learned from Kubrick on 2001: A Space Odyssey and make a spectacular entrance. This one scene needed 45 different shots, averaging 1 a day, for the travel pod containing Kirk to make its flight from the Space Office complex to the docking ring. Double shifts around the clock were required to finish the effect on time. Trumbull and his team also had to rebuild all the lighting and repaint the Enterprise miniature to justify why Kirk and Scotty could view the ship in deep space with no nearby light sources. And they did have other problems with the Magicam models. The lights on them were too dim, so Trumbull rewired them. He found the Enterprise model was too small to film, so a special periscope lens system was needed for close-up film angles. The models were filmed in multiple passes and composited together in post-production. Multiple passes with only the model's lighting running were added to the original pass for the final look. The Klingon cruiser sequence was developed to avoid an opening similar to Star Wars, with one model used for all three seen in the film. 3 models were made by Dykstra and Apogee to represent the Epsilon 9 station. For distance shots, a 6 by 3.5 foot model was utilised, and closer range shots, a separate 5 by 6 foot panel. Rear projection screens were used to replicate the station control tower and add people to it. During Spock's spacewalk and the dry dock sequence, a 2-foot model spaceman made specifically for the shot was used. Time constraints forced the station's unique destruction effects to be discarded. V'Ger was filmed in a dim, smoke-filled room, partly to suggest depth, and partly to conceal the areas of the ship that were still under construction. It's time to segue, though, into the obligatory Keanu reference for this episode. And this is a part of the podcast where I try to link the movie that I'm featuring with Keanu Reeves, because he is the best of men, and obviously Robert Wise is the director of this movie. Robert Wise directed the original The Day the Earth Stood Still. Keanu starred in the remake in 2008. I have actually used that reference before on the episode on West Side Story, but that episode was an episode that hardly anyone listened to, so I'm getting away with using it twice. But that's the weird thing about movie podcasting. Sometimes you do a movie musical and it basically blows up, like Mamma Mia. And then other times you do movie musicals like West Side Story 1961 and West Side Story 2021, and hardly anyone listens to it. So yeah, if you didn't know, Robert Wise also directed the original The Day the Earth Stood Still. We do need to talk about the music though, because I have briefly mentioned Jerry Goldsmith's theme, and he began his long relationship with the Star Trek film and TV series with the musical score for Star Trek the Motion Picture. And it was John Williams' sweeping score for Star Wars that served as the main inspiration for Goldsmith, who used cutting-edge equipment to record and produce the sound effects. His composition was well received by critics, and it is regarded as one of Goldsmith's best ever compositions. But then he also did the score for The Mummy, and as we know, that is the greatest movie ever made, so I will always give props to Jerry Goldsmith. And as much as I love the score for The Mummy, his score for Star Trek the Motion Picture is also very, very good as well. So, with all of the problems behind the scenes on this movie, it is remarkable that this movie ever got released in the first place, but it did get released. And when we say time was of the essence on this movie, it really was. This movie went right to the wire, with prints of the movie being shipped out to theatres with no time to spare. Reels of film were coming out of the lab still wet and being immediately shipped to theatres. Because Robert Wise had to deliver something, finished or not. Owing to the rush to complete the film, Star Trek the Motion Picture was never screened for a test audience, and this was something that Robert Wise later regretted. He personally carried the fresh print of the film to the world premiere, held at the KB MacArthur Theatre in Washington, D.C. The premiere was attended by Wise, Gene Roddenberry, and the principal cast. On its wide release on the 7th of December 1979, Star Trek the Motion Picture set a box office record by making $11.9 million in its first weekend. It earned $17 million in its first week, eventually grossing $82.3 million domestically, making it the 5th highest grossing movie of 1979 in the US. Worldwide, it grossed $139 million. Adjusted for inflation, it remains the highest grossing film of the Star Trek franchise worldwide. But the theatrical version of this movie is not the end of the story. So let's go through the different versions of this movie. Obviously, we have the theatrical version, the version that came out in 1979. A television version of the movie featuring approximately 13 minutes of extra footage was released by Paramount in 1983. Robert Wise always regretted the version that went out theatrically in 1979, and he wasn't given the chance to revisit the movie on his own terms until 1999, during the height of DVD. In a letter to Sherry Lansing, the chairman of Paramount at the time, he asked her to revisit the project, reopen post-production, because he wanted to finish Star Trek the Motion Picture the way he wanted to finish it. With his revised cut, Wise was able to remove unwanted editing decisions and add better visual effects. When his friend David C. Foyne produced the director's edition, it was initially made available on DVD in 2001 and received positive reviews from both reviewers and fans for being a significant upgrade over the original theatrical release. Despite Wise's excitement and belief that it was a superior movie, the director's edition was only finished in standard definition, which meant, to Wise's annoyance and the dismay of the fans of the 2001 director's edition, Paramount was compelled to return to the original negative of the theatrical cut when TV sets began displaying in high definition. So the only version available in high definition was the original theatrical release, and not Robert Wise's director's edition. Robert Wise would pass away in 2005, and prior to his death, Fane promised him that he would find a way to do right by the director's edition and release it in high definition. In 2022, after more than 4 decades of waiting, 1979's Star Trek the Motion Picture was finally completed the way Robert Wise intended, with a 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray release of Wise's director's edition. David C. Foyne fulfilled the promise he made to his friend. Foyne and post-production supervisor Mike Metassino, a former assistant to Wise, worked together to recreate, enhance and complete the visual effects, with Dolby Vision high dynamic range, providing added depth and colour palette to the visuals, and a new audio Dolby Atmos soundtrack, bringing greater texture to audio, plus for the first time ever, original voice recordings of the cast, which Wise directed during ADR, were unarchived and incorporated into the film. In addition to staying faithful to Wise's vision for the 2001 director's edition, the 1983 extended television edit, the original theatrical cut, and an 8-part documentary titled The Human Adventure that chronicles the ambitious 43-year journey were all included in Paramount's limited edition The Complete Adventure Collector's Set. It's worth adding that Paramount's original release plans for Star Trek the Motion Picture called for 70mm prints in key markets, but due to the film's late completion and the studio's unwillingness to delay its release, the 70mm print order was cancelled, and the film was issued entirely in 35mm upon its opening on the 7th of December 1979. At least one 70mm print, however, appears to have been struck at a later date, allegedly for awards consideration screenings, and then placed in the studio's repertory bookings inventory. So there is at least one 70mm version of Star Trek the Motion Picture in existence. After all of the fan fever and expectations, Paramount was disappointed by the financial gross of Star Trek the Motion Picture. With a $46 million budget that included Phase 2 production expenses, Star Trek the Motion Picture was the most expensive film ever made in the United States at the time. The studio blamed the slow pacing and underwhelming box office receipts to Roddenberry's creative direction and script revisions. Although the motion picture's success persuaded the studio to support a less expensive sequel, Roddenberry was removed from creative control. Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan, which was directed and produced by Harve Bennett and Nicholas Meyer, carried on the Star Trek franchise and is seen as the best of the franchise, but retrospective reviews for Star Trek the Motion Picture are a lot warmer than the critical reviews at the time. Because it was seen as a critical disappointment, with remarks on its uneven script, slow pace and lackluster villain being compared to other science fiction classics of the time like Alien, 2001: A Space Odyssey and Star Wars. Critics were mixed. Those who loved it, and those who didn't really didn't. Contemporary reviews of the recent 4K re-release, as well as Wise's director's edition, are a lot more positive. Star Trek the Motion Picture has steadily grown in reputation over the years, gradually beginning to hold its own with fans, even as later favourites like Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan and Star Trek IV The Voyage Home ascend to the top of the franchise. Star Trek the Motion Picture was nominated for 3 Academy Awards: Best Art Direction, Best Visual Effects, an incredible achievement in itself considering the rush to get them finished, and Best Original Score. And I'm sure you know, it was followed by several sequels. Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan in 1982, Star Trek III The Search for Spock in 1984, Star Trek IV The Voyage Home in 1986, Star Trek V The Final Frontier in 1989, and Star Trek VI The Undiscovered Country in 1991, with Star Trek Generations following in 1994, Star Trek First Contact in 1996, Star Trek Insurrection in 1998, and Star Trek Nemesis in 2002. The series was rebooted in 2009 in an alternative timeline created by Spock, with Star Trek, followed by Star Trek Into Darkness in 2013 and Star Trek Beyond in 2016. A fourth movie has been talked about for years but has never materialised, and I have a lot of time and fondness for the 2009 movie, so much so I mooted doing that as my first Star Trek episode. But I think most people will agree I chose wisely. One of the mantras of this podcast is that all movies, whether you enjoy them or not, are little miracles. All movies deserve to be celebrated, some more than others, but the fact that a group of professionals come together to make something at all is a miracle. It fails so often, and given all that has transpired in the years leading up to Star Trek The Motion Picture's release in December 1979, it's perhaps a miracle that the film was even coherent. It may not have been what Robert Wise wanted to release, but what we got was actually rather special. Not just for the fans, but the positive power of fandom is something I've spoken about before, and Star Trek's fandom are widely seen as some of the best examples of positive fandom. That's why I'm hoping I did good with this, because the fans deserve it, and this movie deserves it. It was a movie I'd never seen before the prep for this episode, because I've only ever seen The Wrath of Khan, as well as the new Kelvin-verse Star Treks. And truthfully, I found the motion picture impressive to look at, but the pace was maybe a little too slow for me. But seriously, the visual effects are stunningly beautiful. And then when you find out it was a rush job, even more impressive. The visual effects are truly a testament to Douglas Trumbull and John Dykstra's incredible work in that they hold up under a modern high-def and 4K lens. Star Trek The Motion Picture is, at its heart, a pure science fiction movie. Possibly the only Star Trek movie that can claim to be so, because it seems to take most of its cues and crew from 2001: A Space Odyssey. It is a slow-moving film. It's about voyaging deep into the unknown and finding ourselves when we get there, rather than balls-to-the-wall action. Finding humanity and compassion in situations, rather than just firing blasters and hoping for the best. There's a sense of grandeur and wonder, especially when you see the Enterprise for the first time. This is truly an impressive achievement in filmmaking, to make something from something else, have it constantly change, then have no visual effects, to having truly breathtaking visual effects, groundbreaking in a movie that's now 45 years old. It may not have a traditional villain, but in many ways, and like most of Star Trek historically, it was a movie way before its time, with its commentary on AI and concerns over artificial intelligence and how human intervention is needed. That AI can't just be relied on to understand the complexities of humanity. It's weirdly ironic that V'Ger wants to communicate with the creator, when Star Trek's creator ended up without the creative control he craved. This movie proved to Paramount that Star Trek could make them big money. This was in many ways the franchise starter, and its huge cost to make meant that Paramount wanted to get their money's worth. Many of the set pieces would be reused for future shows like The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. This movie upgraded the look of the Klingons, a look that continued onwards. The Federation space station in this movie was turned upside down to become Space Station Regular 1 in Wrath of Khan, and the de facto starbase for The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. The new Enterprise sets were recycled for the subsequent 5 Star Trek movies and the future TV series as well. The corridors of the refit Enterprise were used on The Next Generation as some of the Enterprise D corridors, and Admiral Kirk's quarters were used as Data and Worf's on The Next Generation. Dr. McCoy's sickbay became Dr. Crusher's office, and parts of the motion picture sickbay became engineering on the Enterprise D. Even the widely unliked costumes were dyed red and reused for Starfleet cadets in The Wrath of Khan. And of course, I've already mentioned the iconic Jerry Goldsmith theme, rearranged by Dennis McCarthy and reused for the next generation. The legacy of Star Trek the Motion Picture continues to live on in future Star Trek projects. The idea of a modern director's cut usually evokes the idea of a studio wanting to squeeze more money out of a beloved classic. See George Lucas's special editions of the original Star Wars trilogy and the fact you can't get the original cuts anymore. But this director's edition was truly a labour of love from a director who admittedly wasn't a huge fan of Star Trek, but who was a huge fan of this project. Star Trek the Motion Picture is a flawed movie, but also truly a one-of-a-kind movie, with an incredible history and legacy, most of which this episode doesn't even touch on. Without this movie, Star Trek would just be a short-lived 60s TV show. It would have been resurrected as a movie at some point, but it likely would never have been as majestic and grandiose and thoughtful. Robert Wise never lived to see his vision for Star Trek the Motion Picture to be fully realised in high definition. This film has reached its final frontier of completion, and the franchise is still boldly going where no person has gone before after all these years. That's worth celebrating on a podcast, right? Thank you for listening. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on Star Trek the Motion Picture, and thank you for your continued support of this podcast. If you want to get involved and help this podcast grow, you could tell your friends and family about this podcast. You can leave a rating, ideally 5 stars, please, wherever you found this podcast. And you can also find me at Verbal Diorama on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, and Letterboxd. You can repost or like posts on social media, and that helps with visibility a little bit too. I feel like Star Trek the Motion Picture is a pretty unique entity, and nothing in the Verbal Diorama back catalogue kind of matches it. So I'm not going to recommend any other episodes. However, I am going to commit to doing more Star Trek movies, so look out for those at some point in the near future. The next episode, though, is the biopic of how legendary director Bobby Bowfinger made the classic Kit Ramsey science fiction masterpiece, Chubby Rain. Now, I don't need to tell you about Chubby Rain. It is Kit Ramsey's best movie, and he is completely terrific as Keith Kincaid, with some of the most incredible dramatic acting you've ever seen, because he looks terrified most of the time, as you would be with an alien invasion in the raindrops. Plus, Gotcha Suckers is the Hasta La Vista Baby of 1999. And if none of what I've just said actually makes sense, then that does not surprise me, because it is a movie that very few people actually seem to know of. But I rented it from a video shop in 2000 and I loved it. And that is the movie Bowfinger. It was written by Steve Martin, directed by Frank Oz, and Bowfinger is a terrific satire of Hollywood movie making. And it also deserves to be celebrated on a podcast. So let's keep it together, keep it together, keep it together. And join me next week for the history and legacy of Bowfinger. And this podcast is free, and it always will be free. However, if you enjoy what I do on this podcast, I am coming up to 260 episodes on the history and legacy of more than 260 movies. If you get any value from that whatsoever, and you have some money to spare, and if you want to support the show financially, there are a couple of ways you can do that. You could go to verbaldiorama.com/tips and give a one-off tip, or you can sign up to support the show at verbaldiorama.com/Patreon, and you can join the incredible patrons of Verbal Diorama. They are Simon E, Sade, Claudia, Simon B, Laurel, Derek, Kat, Andy, Mike, Luke, Michael, Scott, Brendan, Lisa, Sam, Jack, Dave, Stuart, Nicholas, Zoe, Kev, Pete, Heather, Danny, Ali, Stu, Brett, Philip, Michelle, Zenos, Sean, Rhino, and Sol. If you want to get in touch with me, you can. You can email verbaldiorama@gmail.com. And you can also find contact information over on verbaldiorama.com as well. And you can also find work that I do at filmstories.co.uk. And finally,
Spock, did we just see the beginning of a new life form?
Yes, Captain. We witnessed a birth. Possibly a next step in our evolution.
I wonder.
Well, it's been a long time since I delivered a baby. And I hope we got this one off to a good start.
I hope so, too. I think we gave it the ability to create its own sense of purpose out of our own human weaknesses.
and the drive that compels us to overcome them.
And a lot of foolish human emotions, right, Mr. Spock?
Quite true, Doctor. Unfortunately, it will have to deal with them as well.
Interrogative from Starfleet. They're requesting damage and injury reports and complete vessel status.
Report 2 casualties. Lieutenant Ilea. Captain Decker.
Aye, sir.
Correction. They're not casualties. They are... List them as missing. Vessel status, fully operational.
Aye, sir.
Mr. Scott, shall we give the Enterprise a proper shakedown?
I would say it's time for that, sir. Aye. We can have you back on Vulcan in 4 days, Mr. Spock.
Unnecessary, Mr. Scott. My task on Vulcan is completed.
Mr. Sulu, ahead warp 1.
Warp one, sir.
Heading, sir?
Out there. That away.
By